Let me go sync. Sweet. Welcome to the Monkey Dance podcast. This is Ohan. And joining us as a co-host today is Ákos.
Hey everyone, I'm Ákos Szegőfi.
And this Ákos is maybe fourth or fifth time on the podcast. I'll put a link to all the episodes he's been on so far.
I've made it to be a co-host now. And
yeah. Definitely regular co-host. And our guest today is Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter Steiglechner.
And I guess we'll kick it off to you directly, Peter. Do you want to tell us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, nice. Thanks, Ohan, for having me, first of all. This is really cool. I'm currently a postdoc at Complexity Science Hub here in Vienna. So that's how Ohan found me. And we've been going to sort of same conferences and same events here in the cognitive science bubble. Right, so I'm basically interested in, my research is focused on how people perceive opinions, how they form their opinions, and what that does to like societal phenomena like polarization, consensus. When do we reach it? What are the conditions? What are maybe also sort of the network structures? That's more like where it come from. I'm sort of pushing it more into the psychology direction at the moment, thinking more about how do people structure their beliefs. Are there any differences between specific groups? Like you can think of the climate bubble structuring their belief system very differently than the startup scene, the tech bros. So that's something where I'm trying to head in and trying to get some more or a better understanding and a more illustrative thinking into why do people even disagree, and why do we sometimes disagree on how much we disagree. That's my core motivation or my core questions that I'm tackling at the moment.
Cool. And when you say the different belief structures for climate and tech, what do you mean by that?
So we all think about beliefs not as isolated things, right? Like my belief on climate change is super related to my belief about environmental destruction. So to me, these are extremely related, positively related. If I care a lot about one thing, it seems very natural to care about the other thing as well. And that's what I mean by structure. These relations that are completely meaningless to maybe an alien coming to this planet who will be like, how the fuck is climate change related to migration? Like there's no obvious relation here. And people have disagreed on this extremely in the past, and they still disagree on how these things relate with each other. It's not only that we disagree on the beliefs or the opinions. I think that's kind of the one type of polarization where, or disagreement that we might have. One person thinks that climate change is extremely alarming. The next person thinks it's manageable. That's one thing, but we also disagree on how that fits into our belief systems, and whether we see any dissonance to other things that are either going on or that we believe.
So do you take it as a fact that people try to harmonize their belief structure, or do you think that there's also like a lot of inconsistencies in people's beliefs?
Yeah, I think that's a core axiom maybe behind all of our research, is that people try to be coherent in some way. And that means coherent in the sense of in your own beliefs. You kind of have to look in the mirror and be like, I'm an okay person in terms of my beliefs. I'm not completely all over the place, at least to the topics that I care about. We all have beliefs where we're like, I know this is not fitting to my general political overall structure, but I don't care so much. But for the core beliefs, at least, we need to be consistent or coherent within ourselves, and we sort of aim to reduce dissonances. But it's not only in the personal, but also in the social. If all my friends are going vegan and I'm not, that's some dissonance. And I can resolve that in many ways. We can also talk about that later. But I think the core axiom is people care about this.
Right. And so the beliefs that I hold carry more weight in terms of the new beliefs that I engage with. But then broader than that, in a sort of auxiliary fashion, you have the beliefs that your social group holds. And so there's pressures both internally and externally in terms of proximity.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, there's new topics coming in, and then you need to sort them also into your existing structure. And I mean, sometimes that's actually not really what I'm doing, but I think that's also a nice phenomenon that sometimes you observe an explanation or like a new thing, and it kind of fits to everything, and it connects things that previously it didn't connect. And that's kind of, everybody knows this. It's a nice feeling, right?
Yeah, true. And you have, so you said that you're more focused or shifting a bit towards more the psychology side. And I want to touch on the network stuff in a bit, but maybe can you walk us through what that means for your work in terms of shifting more towards psychology?
Yeah, so I mean, the main reason for that is just that I got this amazing position at Complexity Science Hub, and the two people who created that position are more on the psychology side, or somewhere between like cognitive science and psychology. So clearly our discussions have been shifting more and more towards this side. Originally, I'm from physics, so a completely different route. And I was really traditional Bachelor of Physics. I then went into like climate change modeling. And that's when I entered this modeling world and sort of got stuck in that, but just reapplied that, as many physicists have done before, to social science, and to really understand not so much how is the physical world changing, which is what we do in climate modeling, but more how do people change their opinions and so on in a social setting. And I've kind of left this... No, I didn't leave it, but like I kind of shifted away from people just social individuals, and they're like a bit like swarms and absorb all the signals that they get from their social environment. And I've shifted more towards we are also complex human beings internally by ourselves. And then there's also a social component to it. That's what I mean by psychology shifting a bit.
I feel like that puts you in a little bit of a precarious position, because there is this, we're psychologists basically at the end of the day, but then we also have network scientists, and network scientists would be claiming, for example, in my field, that it's the network structure that matters, and then the psychologists would be saying that no, it's the individual psychology of the nodes in the structure that matters. And what's your take on the debate?
Yeah, I think you put the finger on the problem. I mean, again, Complexity Science Hub, I think it's a complex system after all. So both definitely matter. And I definitely don't think people are just defined by their position in a social network. Clearly not. We differ also in the way we process that social information. If you put Ohan in my exact spot, he would perceive my friends and my everything a bit differently, and I think that's the psychology part of it. And of course, we need to neglect a few things if we want to study anything interesting. So you cannot capture the whole picture. So I think it's a question of what are you interested in, and what is the phenomena, what is the level of thing that you want to describe. If we talk about polarization in like one topic, let's say abortion, without considering any other topics, then maybe it's enough to say that people are somewhat reflected as a position in a social network. But if we talk about people not understanding each other's realities, then I think we need to move also into this field of like there's also something going on internally that evolves in a way that doesn't match anymore with the people you're surrounded with, or the people you observe in the news or whatever.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense, because also I don't know the specifics of how it was in other countries, but in the United States, abortion became an issue on the right in about the 70s. And it was legal for a long time, and nobody really made a fuss about it until it became incorporated into the identity, the social political identity of the right. And then it got kind of picked up.
Yeah.
And so there's this interesting thing of once a topic becomes politicized, then it kind of, people adopt it into however they see their sort of social group structure.
Yeah, it's the same for climate change, actually. So famously, Margaret Thatcher was like a huge proponent for tough emission laws and everything. And like she was really all about we need to protect the planet and the climate. And I think she was talking more about environment at that point. But yeah, I mean, one of the most conservative politicians we've had in European politics, like, was kind of one of the fighters for climate change, for protecting against climate change, and like it's completely changed. Yeah.
True in the United States as well. It used to be a right-wing issue, and the
Also in
left,
Europe.
the left was pushing back and saying it's some elitist way to push the working class out and make parks everywhere.
Yeah.
And the right wing was, it's wild how that ends up shifting. But I empathize a lot with also the trajectory, because I started in maths, applied maths, game theory, and then was working in sustainability for years before it was like, okay, time to shift into the mind, and why people hold the belief seems to be, something like a root cause. I don't know if we're deluding ourselves, but by trying to understand why people believe the things they believe, especially that we're not damaging the climate. But yeah, that's quite an interesting thing.
I had a nice anecdote on that. Like, I wrote a master thesis at a climate research center in Germany, and I don't know, it felt so weird to study climate change, because you really want to be successful also in your science, right? So the more you find things that really fuck the planet up, the more you're like, yes, I found it. And at some point I realized
someone who's researching fake news, I shared the sentiment like, yes, this is really disgusting. Yes, this is gonna look so good in the introduction of my paper. And on the other hand, it's like, ooh, wait a second,
Wow.
I shouldn't be so grateful for finding this really ugly piece of information.
yeah.
Man, this is going to turn into a support group. I work on biases, and then every time I find like how the beliefs we bring into a context change how we engage with information, I'm like, yeah, cool. Damn, yeah, this is the darker side of the research that we do, I guess. But it's nice. I think the thing that we can relate to, which some scientists prioritize, some don't necessarily, is that there's a strong drive for the thing that we're looking for. There's a strong motivation that comes externally of why we're doing exactly what we're doing. I mean, looking at climate science, looking at belief dynamics, looking at fake news, looking at biases, it's a reflection, at least for me, I think for Ákos as well, from all the conversations, of how we see the problems that we're facing through humanity, as humanity. And, maybe we can do a little bit to move the needle, or do a little bit for our understanding of how to move the needle. And so I think that's an interesting way to, and I know Complexity Science Hub kind of looks at this as well, right? Like how you can use complexity science to look at problems that we're facing.
Yeah. I think also an important aspect is just that, I mean, of course I want to like do something good in terms of let's face the challenges that we have in a most sort of productive way, like climate change and any other of these grand political challenges, from hunger to poverty to you name it. Like obviously you want to do something about this and you want your research to contribute to this. But I think a core motivation is also that you want people to just like get a better understanding of what they see, maybe. And I think in that sense, like doing psychological or cognitive science research is kind of cool, because it shows sort of it gives people models at their hand, and it like formalizes things. It puts it into words and equations and tractable objects that maybe they I mean, surely people know about these things, but they don't have the language to express it in the way that we do here in like this interdisciplinary research. And I think that's something that I really like to, or that pleases me, if people come after a talk or something and they're like, I always knew this. This is like super trivial, super obvious, but I never really thought about it that way. And that's I think that's great. That's what what keeps me in this job, I guess.
Yeah.
I had a similar experience with one of my teachers, my psychology BA, and she was saying that, all right, so if someone asks why psychology is useful, is that we can put into words what everyone knows. And I think that's very true. In a sense, obviously, we can formulate newer sentences and disambiguate between different folk wisdoms, and that's also something that psychology can do. But I can definitely, I relate to that.
I'll copy that sentence. That I like that a lot. Yeah, nice.
Yeah, offering the ability to formalize, I think, is one of the crucial things that we do, especially when you're looking at psychology, is that everybody's engaging with their own mind and how they engage with the world. There's self-reflection going on for everyone. And the ability to formalize this, put words to what we experience, let us learn about ourselves. I feel like when I get into conversations about cognitive psychology, people outside of the field are like, well, what can you tell me about myself? About how the brain works or how the mind works that I don't know. And I think that there's something inherently appealing about that work. And I also see that as one of the core advantages of science communication in our field, right? Which is that people are inherently interested in people and how people function.
Yeah.
So the working at the network level, I think, is quite an interesting thing because, again, your level of explanation is something very different. And the way I imagine it in my head, because I think a lot about beliefs and belief structures internally, is that an individual belief basically has the same position in the node, but it's just that the whole individual is kind of the superset. But now if you're looking at networks, you're looking at a cluster of individuals as a superset. Every individual is the node. Does that kind of track with you as how you see it as well, like shifting from more network science to cognitive science?
So the model or the idea, the conceptualization of belief systems that I'm working with these days a lot is the two supervisors that are in my project, they call it networks of beliefs, which is you have a social network. That's exactly what you describe. But then in each node, which is a person, you have another network. That's the internal network. And so you have like two layers of networks. And I think there's some advantages of that way of thinking, and also, of course, some disadvantages or some baggage that you bring along with this metaphor. But I think it's a very natural way of thinking about it. So totally agree with that's how you move from the sociological point of view to a more internal.
What will be the disadvantage? Beat you by 1 second.
Yes.
So I think any metaphor brings along some disadvantage, right? Like here, for example, I think one of the disadvantages of a network representation is you have a lot of variables. Every belief can be related to everything. And like if we start to vary that or to have a model about how people form this, it's quite difficult to actually get coherent networks. And I think in some sense, I'm pretty sure there must be better ways of capturing this as like this is not how humans do it. They don't have a network in their head and like they walk through their belief network or something. But yeah,
yeah, that's quite interesting. So when you look at a specific network, are you looking at certain beliefs being more prioritized, and there being sort of a cascading effect of other beliefs falling in line? How do you structure that?
Yeah, ideally, I think that's something that we would like to explain. That's something that we wouldn't want to put in. So we would maybe you can think of it as starting with like a random soup. You're a baby. You don't have any beliefs. Maybe I don't know anything, but
some people would disagree.
Yeah,
exactly. I can imagine. Yeah, I just thought about it.
Center. What's your words?
Immediate dislike.
Anyway, I'm sure you don't have beliefs about climate change, and you're not sure how to relate them if you have them. So you would start like with something like that, but somehow it would evolve in a way, that's the hope, so that some things become extremely central to you. For example, this abortion topic there's no reason why this should be so central. And we also know that a lot of people, if they didn't know about this political divide, they would probably not care so much. It becomes a identity marker in that sense, and that's what they care about. But somehow it's all coming down to this one particular belief. And of course, that's not the whole story. There's a lot more beliefs, but that's something that we would want to get out. Why do we care about? Why do some beliefs become more central in your personal network?
And do you make a difference in between beliefs acquired in different ways? So I may have beliefs about this room being in a certain color or something like that, and then when it comes to climate change, I would acquire these beliefs through communication. And it feels to me that then that would make a difference. So maybe the communicated beliefs are so central to me because I have a really, really high level of trust in the source that communicated it.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think in many of the applications that we study at the moment, it's too abstract. We basically just lump together beliefs, attitudes, opinions, all the same, which is of course a gross oversimplification. But I do agree, and we have that to some extent in our model, that we often think about beliefs that are debated and beliefs that are like just personal. Everybody has them, like maybe something about God or things that are not like up to debate so much, but they still influence the things that you debate, and we're not really naming them because it's extremely abstract. It would be, I think, giving a false sense of what we're actually doing if we would nail it down, because it's very at least that part of the project, which I've talked about, this networks of beliefs. It's still rather abstract, I would say.
Right. And there's probably some kind of relationship between the frequency of the discussion, how often it appears in the public debate on social media or news, and then how salient it is for people to actually talk about.
Yeah, that's an idea actually that we've been starting to talk more about, that from these networks we should get at least some idea whether people talk about the belief, what color this room has, probably not, or talk about something that is very central in their political belief network.
Yeah, that's an interesting sort of thing, because part of engaging with society is understanding that the beliefs that may be relevant for you and the beliefs that you form are going to be shifted by the current narrative structure. So there's just what we're going to speak about. And I think there's a case that comes to mind of atheism being discussed as a major topic 10, 15 years ago, was constantly in the public debate, and then people were having more conversations about religion, and I feel like that even polarized the conversation more than anything else. And so it seems like there are times when you can try to highlight a topic, and somehow that topic can be taken out from under you, and then your attempt to change minds can actually work against you and create a polarization, which is also a strange phenomenon. Yeah,
actually, that's something that I'm trying to write up at the moment. So we have these networks of beliefs, and in that model, we actually wanted to describe how do people form these networks, and do they arrive at different networks. So there's some type of Hebbian learning going on, sort of like in this belief network. And then once you have a bit of heterogeneity in these belief networks, now you apply an intervention on one of the beliefs. Something like, I don't know, the Ibiza scandal here in Austria, like from 0 to 100 perceptions of the Chancellor, I think, Sebastian Kurz in 2019, completely changed, at least for like a time when this was covered in the news and everything. And during that intervention, probably a lot of people, like nobody will be like, I still love him, he's the best. You kind of like, everybody does shift their opinion. It's such a strong push or pull. But it's not sure where, like afterwards, when this intervention is gone, or like the force is not so strong anymore, some people go back to their original. Some like revert, sort of, and for some it becomes very manifest, or like it's ingrained still in their belief network. And I think that's super interesting, to like something that for some time it seemed to like shift the whole opinion, but afterwards it's polarizing again. And I think that's something that we want to at least illustrate. This is a very theoretical model, but we do find this in certain conditions, and we want to sort of describe what are these conditions. When does this happen? Does it happen mostly to people who are who have extremely different networks, or if I don't know, these sort of underlying factors. That's what we're interested in. But I think what you're saying is perfectly describable with such a mechanism, and that's cool.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that happens is if you look at presidential approval ratings in any country, you can kind of look at the dips with scandals, and then within a month or so, that dip is usually erased, and there is a pretty steady average, unless the president or prime minister is really failing. I mean, you don't really see a drop; you just see peaks and troughs.
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe this is a little bit off topic, but there's also something where if you have a healthy political system, a scandal is going to almost uniformly impact perception of that leader. But if you have a very unhealthy political system, then you're going to have some people who react and sort of adjust their belief. So if somebody's in a corruption scandal, you'll have one side who says, well, he's corrupt, she's corrupt, so we should move away from them. But then the other side that'll say, oh, it's just a smear campaign. And so I feel like in a healthy democracy, you can look at the evidence, trust the institution, and then adjust your belief. But in an unhealthy situation, like what you have in the United States, like what you have in Hungary, right? Like you have one group that says, look, they're corrupt, and the other group that says, it's just false news.
In Hungary, the other group would say, every politician is corrupt. Even worse.
That's cynical.
That's very cynical.
You're right. There's one stage worse, which is support for the autocrat and just cynicism.
But I think this is super relevant, what you're saying. There's so many different ways how to resolve dissonance. And I think we should really, that's maybe a topic for you, Ákos, but there's certain facts that every reasonable person will agree on. Like you see the evidence, and like if a political scandal happens, nobody will be like, yeah, that's like, or at least until now, we believe videos of a president doing something. But we try to integrate that information in very different ways. And you can cut all the media out by saying it's all a smear campaign, I don't trust media anymore. You can resolve the dissonance by saying that politician is stupid and I hate him. Or you go to a cynicism state and just like cut every connection so you don't feel anything anymore. Maybe that's a bit exaggerated, but like there's so many ways to resolve dissonance, and I think that's something we often forget when we do a campaign, maybe an environmental protection campaign, and we believe it changes people's opinions, and we are surprised it doesn't. And I think some of the mechanisms are there.
Yeah, there's a lot of, this is touching more on Ákos's field, but how you look at the real effect of misinformation. And it seems, at least my reading of it, correct me if I'm wrong, but
Sure.
It seems like these higher order beliefs aren't really affected by misinformation, but the specifics of the belief are triggered by misinformation. So you might not convince somebody necessarily who strongly believes in institutions that vaccines are suddenly unsafe. But somebody who does believe that maybe institutions aren't to be trusted, pharmaceutical companies aren't safe, you might convince them that there are microchips in vaccines. So misinformation to me seems to have this effect of, if you are susceptible, if you're already leaning that way, it'll give you something to latch onto, which makes misinformation very dangerous because it can tell you when and where to go shoot someone, for example, which is very dangerous. But it doesn't seem, like when I look at the range of work, it doesn't seem to, at the core level, change people's sort of higher order beliefs. Does that kind of track with how you see it as well?
I think so. I think what is often forgotten from this is that, there is this level of argumentation which would say that, okay, misinformation, fake news is just justification that you think that you already believe. That would be like a higher order belief. And to me, that often translates to all justifications don't have any causal effect on behavior. And I think that's wrong. They do have a causal effect on behavior. And without the justification, certain behaviors would never take place. So it obviously has an effect on behavior. So yeah, I think that is largely right. It's just that I often also feel like with misinformation, also with conspiracy theory topics, we often forgot about the fact that it's not like people fail to update their beliefs about information on climate or anything like that because they don't have the faculties to do so, or because they're not educated well enough. They don't update their beliefs because they don't trust the source that communicates the information. So they don't even engage that part of their mind that would be responsible for belief updating. You just don't update at all. So it's not, I mean, conspiracy theory believers, let it be climate change conspiracy believers, or let it be anti-vaccination conspiracy believers. These people do not think that scientists are not competent. On the other hand, they think that they're super competent. They're running this, shadow government that is trying to do, great reset thing in the population. What they don't trust is in the benevolence of scientists. And when scientists go out and try to do an intervention saying that, oh, but look at the sample sizes and how nice of a paper we have written about Pfizer or anything like that, they don't care at all. They don't trust you. They don't trust you at all. And I think it was, it may have been Roosevelt, but I might be wrong, who said that people do not care how much you know until they feel that you care. And I think that's very, very true for these kind of belief mechanics. And I think that when we're trying to do an intervention, that's not explaining the scientific method is not what we should be concentrating on. We should somehow try to think of, okay, why did these people lose their trust in us being benevolent, in us looking out for their best interests? And after that is done, then we can explain scientific methods if necessary. But my hunch would be that it wouldn't even be that necessary, actually, if they have sufficient enough trust.
Yeah, and this kind of touches on Peter's earlier point of people want to look at themselves in the mirror and say, I'm a good person. And I think people on either side of the vaccine debate believe that they are actually trying to help people, and that people's healthcare is in their best interest.
Yes.
And this main problem of institutional trust, the trust in the sources, can undercut any argument. And somehow we need to kind of reinstill that into a network. But how do you see that working on the networks themselves?
Yeah, I think Ákos' point, I was, while you were making it, thinking about how that would look in a network, in a networks of belief model. And I think it fits very well. You have a strong belief that science is not trustworthy, and you get a lot of consonance from hearing a news source that you don't agree with, like vaccines are safe, and you're like, sure, I don't feel the dissonance to anything else, to my belief about vaccines, because it's overshadowed by my consonance that I feel with, like, these scientists are not doing a proper job, or benevolent.
Rightfully so. I mean, one of the sad but also understandable things about psychology is that benevolence trumps competence. So if I'm not convinced that a source is communicating to me, is acting in good faith, then it doesn't matter what they say, no matter how competent they are. So we have to deal with the benevolence part first. They'll be like, how to? I'm a little bit clueless about that, to be honest.
Yeah, and this kind of touches upon some work that I'm doing, which is preferences for competence can be overridden if there's a team dynamic, if there's a group dynamic. So I can prefer people from my own group, even if they're demonstrably less competent. And that seems to be quite an interesting phenomenon too. Again, there's many layers in how we interpret information, and it's also that we're looking at it as, okay, we're putting this information out there, people are going to have to engage with it, but that's also not true. Is people actively avoid information they disagree with. Right. So it's not only confirmation bias, it's also avoidance of information that we disagree with.
Yeah, that's nice. It's actually my first ever paper that I wrote on these opinion dynamics things very early in the PhD, and I knew nothing basically about like all the things that you know so well about psychology and identity. But I kind of just assumed the most simple idea that like you meet someone, you either have a red or blue hat, red or blue identity, and you're gonna trust the person with the same hat as you a little bit more. And then you do Bayesian updating and you just get very different results, obviously. And I think that's something that was like as a first year PhD student in opinion dynamics research, it was kind of exciting for me to just incorporate that even a Bayesian way of doing things, there is biases in there, like how much do you take that information of the person that is talking to you as a trustworthy source? And obviously, identity is the key element in this. And of course, we made a very simple example with like 2 identities, you belong to it or not. We know the story is much more complex, but we tried to connect this to the climate change debate. I started my PhD in 2020, so it was like heavily influenced by Fridays for Future and like Greta Thunberg, and so this new way of doing or seeing climate, presenting climate activism as like, we, the young generation, we are standing up now against you, the old generation. Right? There's a strong motive, not pushed by everyone in there, and of course also there was a lot of mix. There was also a lot of cross-generational protest and agreement about these issues. But the story did use generational identity as a key marker. So we assumed that if you just communicate in a social network now, and you update your beliefs based on the opinions of others, but also using identity as a marker for how trustworthy that person is, how certain you think that person, or how much you trust that person's opinion, sort of. Then sometimes you get more polarization. But in certain networks, you actually get less polarization, and that's cool.
True. Because people are accounting for the strength of the evidence. And
exactly.
that's a crucial part of the Bayesian process. Right?
Exactly, yeah. We sort of shifted the likelihood, or we squeezed it. And if you think that person is zero trustworthy, you completely squeeze it. It's irrelevant information. You don't update your belief at all. But if you think it's perfectly accurate, you take it at face value. And so in a random network, you would just find that this increases polarization. One group is doing that, the other group is doing that. But if you construct a network in a way that the in-group talks more with each other, but also they are all kind of locally connected to people from the out-group, it's kind of, you can think of it as sort of 2 rings that you stick to each other, 2 ring networks. Old generation, young generation, you stick them together. Everybody's basically talking, all the kids are talking to their parents. In that network, actually, that bias helps to foster consensus because it spreads the opinion in one of the groups faster than it increases disagreement. And then once you have that consensus, locally, you can still convince, at least if there's some trust, of course, you can convince also people from your outgroup. If there's some cross-identity trust, at least a minimum amount, and that actually helps to form consensus. So in an unbiased society that does not have this in-group bias would actually produce consensus less often than a biased society in that very particular setting.
Yeah, you have this problem of echo chambers, right? Of people not actually communicating with each other, and that is definitely a problem because then you can very easily dehumanize the other group. You know, my in-group is very diverse, but the out-group is just one monolith of disgusting people. And I think it's interesting because this intergenerational aspect is really important for finding common ground. And usually the reason why people within generations are hanging out are because they're related. And because they're related, they have some kind of shared beliefs about how the other person should continue to exist, right? And I think that ends up being quite powerful. But there's this level of trust there that we can extend, and humanization that we can extend to our relatives that is unfortunately not extended to other human beings at large, even though there's ostensibly no difference, right? So,
yeah. And yet it's becoming more and more complicated in a globalized world. Right, like it's not only kinship that matters for identity. It's really also more abstract things, as you see with Gaza, for example. I think I know a lot of people who are very emotionally attached to either Israelis or Palestinians or both, but like it's just very complicated to to define who you actually care about as part of your in-group.
Yeah, that's true. And it can make it very difficult to extend empathy to anybody that you see as having a different belief, whether they're climate change, anti-vaxxers, whatever situation. And you have almost like a check that you have to pass through, which is, yes, I will accept the humanity of all the people on my side and deny the humanity of all the people on the other side. And then this has a serious runaway effect, where you're constantly checking each other, and there's a sort of virtue test you have to pass, which I think makes it very difficult to depolarize the situation. Yeah. Is that something that you've played with in models as well? Like this aspect of out-group sentiment or in-group sentiment?
Yeah, I haven't really touched out-group derogation much. We just made this distinction of like you focus on your in-group or you trust it a bit more, but that never really got into like actual antagonism sort of so far. But I think I totally agree with you that this is kind of the situation that the US has gotten itself in.
And you work on sort of the social identity being a factor in the models. How do you operationalize that? What does the inclusion of that in the model look like?
Yeah, and this very original model that I was talking about, it was basically just an attribute, just like blue hat, red hat, end of story. But in my more recent work, we're saying it's a bit of a different work. It's not so much opinion dynamics, but it's about how you perceive opinions of others. And from that, we want to study how some people perceive strong polarization and others don't actually. Or we actually disagree also on how much polarization there is in certain topics. For example, the climate debate, where a lot of maybe conservative people, for example, they don't really see this polarization that a strong climate bubble sees. So what we did there was we used identity just as a who are you relating to, kind of like whose opinion is becoming a reference point for you. That's how we used it. So to me, identity is simply like a group belongingness, or like a marker that, that person is one of my own. But I think that's definitely one of the extremely simplified things in all of my work. So I'd be very happy actually to hear more about how you do it in your work and like how you see identity.
No, I'm very sympathetic to this, because I think the best way to understand identity is sort of pragmatically looking at it as the output of somebody in their behavior in a particular social situation. Because I think otherwise it's very difficult. You can't just pry their mind open and look at what the beliefs are that they hold, right? But I conceptualize identity as somebody's just internal belief network, this mutable hierarchy of beliefs, basically. And I think the only way to probe that is to see their behavior. So, yeah.
There's these early 1960s belief network studies where they asked people, or a huge population, about number of things, what they care about, what they believe, and so on. And then they just correlated everything with everything. And from that, they got relations between beliefs, clearly, or between any item, basically any survey item. And it turns out that identity really is the key, the middle thing. It's the most central node. And that's where people construct their
Whose work was this?
Converse.
Okay.
In, I think, 1964, okay. The Nature of Belief Systems. It's kind of a funky study. This is just
nice.
Basically, it's methodologically, it's the most simple you can do.
But I mean, I want to defend a little bit the idea of like the red hat and blue hat and stuff like that. I'm sure that you can come up with a more elaborate sort of explanation. But if you can show that the effects that you're looking for are there even with the red hat and the blue hat, then I think you're good. You identify the minimal condition in which identity matters, like the original social identity experiments by Touchfell. Do you like this abstract picture or you don't like this abstract picture? And you created two quasi groups, and it seemed that they already elicited the kind of biases. So it's just like, I don't think that in terms of operationalization, you don't necessarily need to go deeper than that. If you have the minimal condition and you already have effects, then you can say that, well, in a more complex way of understanding identity, probably you're going to find more. But
yeah, Solomon Asch, 1956, right? Line segments. So how you judge line segments creates affinity within people, which I think is also a big part of our engagement with information online. Somebody that you don't know likes something that you said in a comment thread argument, and all of a sudden you have affinity towards them. It's like, what is that? The base tribalism. Maybe if this gets
very
to
narcissistic
violence,
people.
I also think that maybe this is too much of a leap. But the way that I make sense of it is that you're making sense of it as if this were to go to violence, there's somebody that might defend me for a particular reason. Maybe it's too evolutionary of an explanation.
I think I like it because if you understand violence as it can be like verbal abuse or something like that, which happens online many times, then I think it is someone shut up a signal that they want to join your coalition, and they're made themselves visible through their like, which means that they're standing with you. So I think that kind of explanation.
You have reinforcements.
Yes.
And
I hope you like me more now.
And there we have our experiment. We put people in a room, we let them fight, we see what comes out.
We basically have like the experiments of ostracism, right? Which shows that being ostracized from any group dynamic or group game strongly shifts behaviors either to, and this is the interesting thing that's very hard to plan for, is when you're ostracized, people either try to appease the members of the group, right? They want acceptance, or they go further away. They get radicalized. And this is the difficult thing, right? Like, why do some people, when put in a situation where they're rejected by their group, why do some people seek conformity? And why do some people reject the group and look for a new group? This is a very hard thing to figure out.
I think this is specifically what Peter could answer with network dynamics. Do you have access to another network after being rejected by one group? If you do, how much do you know about this other network and the payoff matrices that are available for you there? And if you don't have enough information and you don't have another network to join, then you're going to do everything to get back to your original network, even if you've been rejected.
I can get why you say that, but also people with no social networks are the ones that are most likely to go towards the extreme beliefs. Right, and when they feel like they've been rejected by everything, then they'll look for flat earthers. They'll look for confirmation wherever
because they would
get
accept anyone who's willing to parrot back their beliefs.
That's the thing. So it's
sorry, I don't mean to.
No, it's true though. I completely agree. I think that I think robustness in your social network is really important. So like a robust social identity, where if one fails, you can lean on the others. I think that's really important for not getting people to have extreme beliefs. And I think that's. Some people on the fringe, when they have no other social groups, you'll see either conformity or you'll see rejection, and I think that's more of the edge case that I'm talking about, where the people that are looking for validation will seek it in their immediate environment, or they'll just go online and all of a sudden join somewhere that's going to give them immediate validation.
Do you know the story of the Unibomber?
Go ahead.
It was this. No. There was an A in there. Unabomber?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. That seems more familiar. It's the story of a terrorist, basically in the U.S. who kind of
mathematician.
Interesting. Nice.
Quite good mathematician.
PhD.
And super radicalized at some point, but a weird combination of beliefs, like super anti-migration, super pro-environmental.
He was anti-migration?
Yeah, he hated foreigners, apparently.
Wow, okay.
He was an isolationist. He thought that we should live in like smaller communities and then protect the environment. So it was he was against migration. I don't know. Maybe he didn't like foreigners, but I don't know. I think he saw migration as a neoliberal globalization threat to to the environment. But please go on.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting to like. how you can radicalize in a completely asocial environment, and not being moderated, not being checked back on, and like, exciting, horrible and exciting.
There's this great Hungarian writer who once said in an interview that in a place where people don't talk to each other, there's a very real danger that everyone gets really smart. And I think it's like, it's probably the case. Yeah, you sort of like, I don't know, just kind of pancake yourself into your own beliefs, and then there you go.
Yeah, was he speaking about everyone's perception of their own intelligence?
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. It was a sarcastic comment from his part, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Without the intersubjective check, you can start getting into some wild things.
That's something that one of the people in my research group, he's as a side project, he was developing sort of like a tool where you can talk with an LLM for hours, basically, and in the background you'll the LLM is basically inferring a belief network about you, it's learning something about you, and you can basically backcheck your ideas. It's kind of like a diary, sort of. But in the end, so the positive way is you can always like confront yourself with some feedback from yourself, from like someone with like an AI basically that has sort of your preferences in mind and your ideas of or perceptions of the world. But I think the negative side is you're talking to yourself in a way, and this is kind of I'm wondering what this does to society if you don't check at least with like Google, but like you check with a replica of yourself,
which is an older replica supposedly. So it's like less information.
I do this with my journal. Keep a journal of every day. I've done it since 2011.
Wow.
Yeah. So I have like a personal reference point that I can check. But it's dangerous if I didn't communicate with other people. One of my closest friends, Michael, and I used to live in the same place, so we used to do this more often. But just practicing this sort of radical honesty of giving each other very blatant, difficult to hear criticism. But you know that it's coming from a place of deep love and mutual respect, and it becomes very difficult to hear, but a very sort of like important way to kind of improve yourselves.
I read about this in Kerouac. They were trying to do this, the merry pranksters.
The merry pranksters, they also practiced radical honesty. It's definitely a thing. Further is an idea, not a place. But yeah, so what? So what are you thinking about these days in terms of work? Like, what are you working on at the moment that's exciting? Where do you think about taking the work?
In my PhD, I started with opinion dynamics, and the first two papers were on cognitive biases, and then noise later, which I think is super relevant Ákos and me, we also talked about this at some point. And then I kind of got a bit frustrated with like these more traditional opinion dynamics models. So my last project was about opinion perception. And this idea, I think I've briefly mentioned it before, that if your in-group is extremely homogeneous on some topic, you don't expect variation, or any deviation from that will matter hugely to you. If we all agree on that the Earth is round, so this is a super low variance topic for all of us. If somebody would come now and like agree with us on climate change, on migration, on anything, but also that the Earth is flat, we'd be like, weirdo. You don't agree.
You seem to be such a nice guy.
But yeah, it would matter a lot. And so variance of your social circle kind of determines, that was the theory, determines how you see distance to other people. And therefore also how you see the evolution of distance, because your in-group evolves, right? And if your in-group evolves and the general population evolves, this can create asymmetries in how you perceive this overall polarization. So I'm quite convinced of like at least this very intuitive I think, very plausible, minimal idea behind this thing. Of course, it was more involved. It was like multiple topics and sort of the idea that people kind of do a dimensionality reduction in that sense. And then different topics will matter differently for one identity group, a political identity group, than for another. And so now that was a theory that we then applied to opinion data on climate change. And we analyzed, assuming this is a process that actually takes place, this is how different groups would perceive polarization. But we never really checked. Like, also, we can't check. It's this data that's just super difficult to get how people perceive polarization, because they mean different things with that, and that's exactly what we are saying, right? Like, there's some relativeness about this. But yeah, now we wanted to design a survey, and that's what I'm currently doing. Sorry, a super long backstory here.
I mean, this is great.
And I'm currently setting up a survey, which I think could be pretty cool, and it could not work. And I think that's kind of what science is about, right? Like, you never know until you actually do it. So I'm starting to first ask you a bunch of questions on political topics, as migration, climate, inequality, and diversity. And then I'm asking you, name 10 people that kind of make up your social circle, friends, family, colleagues, people you kind of care about, and you discuss politics perhaps, or at least you know about their political stance, and it's something that's going on in your head. And then I'm asking the same 4 questions to about all of these 10 contacts. So you're giving me the 10 answers of your friends and colleagues and so on for this question, this question, and this question. And that tells me the variance of your social circle. And from that, basically, using that theory, we could predict how you perceive distances then to, say, now a party voter, which you also evaluate as a third step. Then I'm asking you, what do you think a typical social democrat voter would put on these 4 questions? And I'm kind of predicting whether you put that person further away in your political space than another person. So we're trying to test that theory, whether this social circle gives us something interesting and meaningful and useful for sort of predicting or better understanding how people then map political distances. And so we compare this prediction with how people then do it. So they get a canvas, they get dots, and each dot is one of these 10 people, yourself and the 7 party voters from German parties. And you drag them around, kind of like an arrangement task. So you put people close together if they're politically close. You put them far apart if you think they're politically far apart. And we'll see. No idea what comes out. And also we're going to ask them, of course, what was going on when you were doing this task. Did you care about one dimension, or maybe 2 or 3 or 4, all 4 equally? And we also want to check whether people actually know what they are doing, whether actually we see that signal. If somebody claims, like, I only cared about inequality, and we find that actually the distance that they give us on this canvas between all the dots does not depend on inequality opinions, then either their perceptions of inequality opinions are wrong, or they don't know that they did actually not care about inequality.
They just said that they did because they thought that was that's quite
That's
interesting.
really fun.
I'm really fascinated by these measures, and actually one of my all-time favorite measures that I myself have never used was the Bogardus scale. So
What's that?
Bogardus scale. The Bogardus scale is basically, you tell people how okay would you be if, let's say, your daughter would to marry an immigrant, or if you had to work together with an immigrant, and people can get really worked up by these kind of questions, and it's like one of the oldest kind of social distance metrics that are still being used in like European values survey as well. Do you see your work as an extension of that, or a better measure, or is that something that you actually use in the survey?
Yeah, that's super relevant. I haven't really engaged so much with. I've seen these questions, and I agree. It's also cool to even think about it. What this reminds me of is there are studies about individual level belief networks where they basically ask things like, imagine you would support gun ownership. How likely would it be that you also support gay rights? Something like that. Well, like, I think there can be a level of counterfactualness that is already for me, and I'm thinking about this day and night, basically. It can be really hard to answer these questions. And I'm sort of wondering what I have no intuition what's going on in my or people's heads when you answer a kind of counterfactual question, or like if I'm I was born and raised in Germany, and there's certain things that like just seem extremely far away from me, like that I cannot even completely grasp how I would be if I were in that situation. If my daughter would marry someone, like no idea. I don't have kids. Like very difficult to answer. So sorry again, long story, but I think something cool about what we are doing is that we don't need people to consider that. I think it's very natural to think about political distance in some way. We also fear a little bit that people are like using party identity just as a cue, regardless of opinion, and like we know that like political opinions don't matter 100% for which party you support. So maybe they also just put that information in. But in general, I think it feels very natural to say, I completely disagree with that person. I'll put them far away.
Right.
That person's closer.
Right.
Yeah, I like this idea of tolerance thresholds for sort of belief divergence. I think that's a really interesting idea. And actually, the work I was doing in my master's, and we never got around to publishing it, but something I always want to circle back to is we had people take a survey, and it was basically building a belief profile. So it was asking them it was statements about the same types of political topics, abortion, refugee rights, immigration status, a bunch of stuff. And it was, worded in a way so that they could agree or disagree. And then they told us how important that belief was to them, and then how knowledgeable they saw themselves. So like these three things for all of these beliefs.
Cool.
And then what we had was, what the manipulation was we basically showed them a group of the rest of the respondents, right? And we showed what the average prioritization and agreement were for all those other respondents. But we manipulated one of the topics. And so we wanted to see if they identified with all of the beliefs that the group had, would they actually change their belief? We find yes. And if we start, the interesting thing is if there were, seven topics, if 6 out of the 7 were basically very similar to them, and one of them was divergent, people would be like, okay, let me see more information about this topic I disagree with my group. But if they weren't agreeing with like 3 or 4 of them, then it wouldn't happen, because they'd be like, that's just not my group.
Cool.
I'm not in the same group as somebody who believes in abortion rights but doesn't believe in refugee rights and doesn't believe in LGBT rights and doesn't believe in. It's not my group. And so I think that ends up being, I think, quite parallel to the thing that you're looking at.
Yeah, very much. This is super cool. It kind of, at least the part before the group identity thing reminds me a bit of one of the side projects that I've been involved in for way too long now. But hopefully we'll soon get this out, where we studied. So there's a bunch of experiments been done by other people in a very similar way as you're describing. So it's kind of a factual question often, or some binary choice thing where you're asked which city is bigger, Geneva or Zurich, and like most people don't have a perfect answer, but maybe there's one of them is a better answer than the other, and then some people get shown, or in some conditions people get shown how many people choose which option, and so you can extract a social influence curve from that. Like how likely are you to choose which answer given the popularity of that option? And it turns out that you can do this not only for asking humans factual questions, but even for, also for dating choices. Which of these two people would you rather, or do you find more attractive? Would you rather date? Something like that. Where the social influence is much less, but you can fit the same curve in a way. You can even do that for fruit flies. They colored fruit flies in like pink and green, and then they let a test fruit fly, and they chose to mate with either the red or the green or the purple fruit flies, depending on how many people fruit flies mated with these flies before. It's ridiculous, but like this is a very general principle that popularity of an option really matters. And I think it's very cool what you're doing. That at some point, it's not that popularity does not matter. Or matters less. It matters nothing because you don't identify with those people. So maybe that's actually a much cooler extension to what we've been trying to do with this.
Yeah, right. Because if there's once there's an opinion in a group you don't agree with, I think that's one of the, because this ties back to the social identity. Yep. Do I identify with my context or not?
Yeah.
And I think it's very different if there's 7 of you on an island, right? If that's not your group, you're going to have very tough going if you don't either pretend or adopt the beliefs. Yeah. But there's, always another option, like we were talking about before, is at the very least you can go online and find somebody in a chat room, that will connect you to a bunch of, occultists or whatever you want to believe in.
I think that variance really matters. If you are only 7 people on this island, and you forget about your previous life, you'll have a variance of opinions, and that's the gold standard that you're measuring things by, right? Like you may disagree still, but it doesn't matter if there's variance and you don't have your option to be in another group with lower variance. I think it's always the context in the sense that shapes how you think about things you think about.
Mm-hmm. And it's not a trivial point, right? This idea of choosing a popular option, I think it's also really interesting because it kind of makes sense epistemically. If I don't know, I know that there's the right answer. I don't know what the right answer is. Yeah. Maybe there's the wisdom of the crowds thing happening. And the interesting thing is, because I work on development, like what we see is that children understand past a certain age. I'm forgetting exactly what the cutoff age here is. I think it's around 4, but they start to understand that via group deliberation you can resolve things like conflict, but you can't resolve things like fact. Mm-hmm. Right? So who broke a window is different from what should we do about the person who broke the window. Mm-hmm. But when they're younger than that, they're like, oh, well, maybe we can just vote. Who broke the window, right? But you can't. And so that's the really interesting thing is at a certain point, children start to understand, okay, when can we use group deliberation and when can we not? And I guess that starts to, when they start to understand, how I think about it, is when they start to understand that there are stronger divisions between fact and fiction. Yeah. And that maybe this is a sort of very central way to categorize information, things that are and things that are not. And then from there, you can kind of categorize everything else in your world.
Wow. Yeah. That makes total sense, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at like when the origin of something develops and then when adults are able to kind of forego that. Yeah. We know that we humans have the capacity, but it's just social influence or context can change how we apply that faculty.
Yeah, we in that study we did like a meta-analysis, so we identified I think 15 experiments, and we group them into what are the experimental settings where no social information should matter, like dating, or do you like the circle or the square better? Something like, if you tell me 90% like the circle better, whatever. Then there's a middle category, and then there's something where basically social influence is critical. Like, for example, are there more green balls or red balls in this box that you can't look in, and you take one of the balls, then of course it matters what other people said, because that will give you the answer. So, I can't really say anything about the results right now because we're still working on it. But I think it's interesting to think about these like very different questions where popularity can matter or not doesn't, and whether people are actually good in. Or we know that there's always social influence in all of these settings, and it's not perfect social influence also. So there seems to be like a general thing that we learn to do probably in childhood to distinguish how much social influence and in what context do I actually need it.
Yeah, and it's just that one more interesting developmental point is we, of course, look at the quality of the evidence that we're getting and kind of weigh that against the quality of evidence that we can gather. You know, and sometimes we use wisdom of the crowds, and sometimes we just kind of rely on ourselves. There's a great set of studies that looked at kids trying to look at what's in a box, but including the box is either it's just opaque glass or clear glass. And if children children are set up with somebody next to them as well, but the person might have either the same type of glass they have or something different. So if children have clear glass, they don't care what the other person said they saw, right, regardless. And if they have opaque glass and the other person has opaque glass, they will go with what they think. But if they have opaque glass and the other person has clear glass, they'll start to obviously lean on the other person's opinion. But they don't really start doing this until around like five years old,
Wow.
right? So they will children have different ways to kind of reconcile this. A lot of times children will just go with their first person experience. It's the most common, or just what they think. There's some children that will always defer to the other person, but then you get this like reliable effect of, you know, if I don't have good quality evidence and they do, I will use their evidence. If we both have bad quality evidence, I'll rely on what I think. And I think that's also quite interesting because there's so many nuances to how we weight the strength of the evidence, right? And the way we update is so dynamic, and this dynamism comes in at a very early age, which you know facilitates this phenomenal developmental trajectory that we have in humans.
Yeah, I'm actually curious how in settings of like misinformation and sort of political campaigns and these things, how things change there. I know there's one study by Michael Macy, I think, where they gave people statements like the Democrats support policy X, and then they turned it around and said the Republicans, and so people were like kind of incentivized to follow their own party leaning, and they did, I think, in a way. They mostly followed.
Right.
But I don't know if there's a completely different setting, maybe also in more sensational news and stuff like that. Like, how do you incorporate social information there? Endorsements.
Whether the popularity of the message, right? I think it's no, it's definitely, I think popularity itself is quite well replicated. So it's just like in political terms, you would like follow what the other voters of the party or what, people who are having similar identity to you would claim. And I think that's sort of reasonable when it comes to the news, given that you've got in very, very few occasions that you've got first-hand evidence to verify yourself. Yeah. So if you already sort of like don't trust the institutional system or the news, then you're just sort of going to rely on what others are saying. And so there was this very, very old model of the effect of news and how news is becoming incorporated, which is called the two-step flow of media communication by Katz and Lazarsfeld by the 1950s. And basically they were saying that what happens is that the media communicates something to masses of people, and then they take it back home to their own little networks, and then they deliberate about it in between each other. And the idea is that since the advent of social media, they try to develop this model, and there are some researchers who are saying that it's a one-step flow right now, because you just receive the news through social media or through some influencer, and you don't really debate it, only with the people who are within your bubble. Whether that digital bubble is that much different from the original real-life social bubble that you would be having, I'm not entirely sure about the argument on that one, but I think it would matter a lot, because the evidence that you have is actually not first-hand evidence, so you need to rely on something.
Yeah, and I guess people do talk with their friends and partners what they see online, so there's still this sort of second layer.
They imagined it as a good thing originally, because if you get some really, really extreme news, then you sort of have this pillowing effect that you have people around you, and they would say, look, man, this is a little bit crazy. I mean, let's just do a little bit. It's not what they would say, but let's do a little bit of a sanity check here, right? It's just like, this is obviously nuts. And then it would just sort of, the effect of these very, very radicalizing, polarizing information would sort of just smooth out. Unless you have a really bad network structure to work with, obviously.
Yeah, and there was also this point, Peter, that you were making is there was a set of studies, and I don't remember if it was might have been from Tajvel or Kunda, but they basically they gathered in the United States whether people were Republican or Democrat, and then they had a policy recommendation. They were it was about things like water, forestation, and things like that. And then they said, your party supports it or your party doesn't support it. Can you write an essay in support of it or against it? And people wrote convincing essays either way.
Wow.
And so that comes up a lot.
And then just because of taking commitment or writing an essay, they would start believing what they have wrote a little bit more. I mean, that was not their original. That was not their original reasoning, but I think it has something to do with commitment. But if you're writing it down, if you're communicating it, then you believe your own bullshit a little bit more.
I definitely agree, because you're putting in cognitive effort to come up with arguments, and I think that
there's
makes
cognitive investment in it. That's true as well. But then you also take public commitment for what you're saying, and you put it down in writing, which stays there, and you know that. So that's like, I gave evidence of what I thought, so I better represent that belief as well. Yeah,
this is when arguments go off track. Somebody just digs a hole and they just decide to stay in it. But it's true that, and kind of touched on this before, but you need distance. You need temporal distance from a claim that you've made in order to feel comfortable enough to say, I've changed my mind on this. And people don't usually want to say in the same argument that they've changed their mind, but a couple of years later, it happens. And I've seen this a lot with friends, people who were Trump supporters in 2016, who then, after distance and a lot of debates in 2016, by 2020 or by 2022, they were very much not for Trump. But that distance allowed them to be like, fuck that guy, and it was just a different time and all this stuff. And you don't even need to discuss it. If they've changed their opinion, they've changed their opinion, and you've kind of rub it in. You might push them back in the other direction, but they might bring justifications of, it wasn't completely irrational because you would. But it's
back
interesting.
At that time,
exactly. We didn't know, hindsight's 2020, and it's like, but it's an interesting thing how people need to also maintain this conception of themselves, not only to them, but what I think you think I am is really important. Yes. And that temporal distance gives me time to resolve that conflict.
Yeah, I think a very interesting line of research is also this distinction or disintegration of like public and private opinion. Something that I'm not doing a lot on, but I think it's speaks to a lot of the things that we have seen, I think, also in the past 10 years of the famous people who always supported Trump but never really dare to say, right? Because you don't want to be the weirdo in your friend group. But as soon as you go to the ballot, that's what you're going to put in. Or if there's a change in sort of the general setting, or you just get aware of a new bubble and so on, like all of a sudden private and public opinion might or public opinion might change, whereas private has been like that all the time. And I think there's an interesting feedback between these two.
Yeah, for sure. So, where, if you kind of had a whole research program you could develop yourself, what would be that project, or what would you be interested in tackling? At least a question or something like that.
Going back to counterfactuals now.
Yeah. Imagine you had money. It's a big question. Wow. So I think something that I'm quite bullish on is like, I know, giving people tools to understand their political structures, and maybe to also understand how these structures are not set in stone. They're not God-given, and first of all, they can change, and probably people disagree on even the structure and even the way we perceive opinions in society. So this, like, I think, yeah, this week is particularly interesting for this, with the Israeli hostages being released, and also the Palestinian detainees or people who Israel put into their prisons were released. And like you see pictures from, like, you see exactly the same pictures in completely different worlds of people being so happy to have their loved ones back and so on. And it's just amazing to see how different the worlds are that these two communities live in, and like how there's just no reconciliation between them, these worlds. And I think we often then are like, Israel and Palestinians, they don't understand each other, so they must differ on something, on their beliefs, on those Israelis, they can't love their families, or the Palestinians, they hate whatever. And like, no, it's not true. They probably have some similarities in their belief networks. They may have the same values and so on, but they connect it differently. And that's why they arrive at a different conclusion and a different interpretation of these things. So that's something where I would really want to use research as like a illustration, more than like finding some cool model or something, which is also might be a cool step in between. But like ultimately, I think that's where I would really like, or where I think a lot of things could be done, and a lot of output of this research would be extremely valuable for society.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful point. I mean, the last question I usually ask, which is, you kind of touched on this answer already, but why are you doing what you do?
The easiest answer, I think, is there was always like a local next thing that I kind of want to do. So when I was in climate research, I was like, climate is maybe not the issue. People really seem to be weird. And then when I finished the PhD, I was like, maybe people are like not so weird. Maybe then like biases, not everything. Maybe there are some other things that can explain like different perceptions and so on. So there was always like something where like, let me check that out. So there's a bit of an opportunistic story, I think. I would like just going with the flow and going with what I found interesting at that particular moment. And then of course also I think it's valuable for, in general, what we do is trying to understand something fundamental, something helpful for society to understand themselves better, or to understand maybe not only themselves, but like society as a whole better. And I think that's just a good thing. And I'm crazy privileged to be like, I don't know, sitting somewhere thinking about these things, writing it up, and building models, formalizing them, checking them, analyzing them. It's a pretty cool job, to be honest. But yeah, we'll see where everything will end up.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment exactly. We're very lucky to get to work on something that has meaning. But thank you so much.
Best of luck with it.
Yeah, thank you. It was really cool to be here. Thanks, Owen
Thanks.
and Ákos.